So welcome everyone here in the audience and those of you watching at home. This is our first experiment with the hybrid model of having a historian in our midst and then having, I think, 40 or 50 people watching from home. So I'm Tom Putnam, the director of the Concord Museum, and we are pleased to be celebrating the opening of our new permanent galleries this week. It's a whole week-long activities that we're calling Celebrating Concord. And it was Henry James who, commenting on the number of literary lions who lived and wrote in Concord, described it as the biggest small town in America. He might have said the biggest little place in America, but I realized I'm among historians, so I have to be historically accurate. But as an example of that, I was tickled when my friend Ellen Fitzpatrick let me know that her longtime friend and fellow historian Jaqueline Jones had recently moved to our town, and Jackie happens to be the current president of the American Historical Association. So I mean, how incredible is that, to be at a small history museum and literally a 3-minute walk down the street is living the current president of the American Historical Association. So I invited Jackie to speak during our Celebrating Concord, and I'm so pleased
Thank
that you
you.
agreed.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation.
And wonderful to meet you. So before I ask my first question, just a very brief introduction. Jaqueline Jones is Professor Emerita at the University of Texas, Austin, where she's also served as the Ellen C. Temple Chair in Women's History and the Maston Gentry White Professor of Southern History. She's held academic positions at Wellesley, Brown, and Brandeis. She's the author of several books. We'll talk about 3 of them tonight, or at least touch upon them. She's a MacArthur Fellow, a Bancroft Prize winner. The Bancroft Prize is perhaps the most prestigious prize in the field of history, and twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer. So I thought I'd start, Jackie, I warned you I would do this. We just went to see the exhibit called Every Path Laid Open, which comes from a quote from Margaret Fuller. And Jackie does posts on the AHA website, the American Historical Association. And I shared this with my whole staff. It's called We Are Only Human, Emotion, Empathy, and the Historian's Craft. It's a lovely anecdote, a nice introduction to who you are as a person and a professor. So maybe you can relay the story that you relay in this blog.
So thank you, Tom. And just here at the beginning, I'd like to congratulate you on this marvelous renovation. The galleries are stunning.
Great.
And I'm so proud to be a resident of Concord, where people take an inclusive kind of history seriously. I mean, it really tells the story of lots of different kinds of people, from 12,000 years ago to the present, and it's great. Anyway, it's an honor for me to be here tonight. So, well, Margaret Fuller, I started my teaching career at Wellesley College and was teaching a 1-year survey of the 19th century. And since it was my first year teaching, I just lurched from one lecture to another. I was really overwhelmed. But in my first semester, I was teaching the antebellum period, and I thought I would introduce my students to some interesting women. It wasn't a women's history course, but I thought they needed to know some women's history. So I realized that if I talked about Margaret Fuller, I could talk about transcendentalism, I could talk about the beginning of women's consciousness, I could talk about New England literary history. So I really worked on this lecture, and I got very involved in the material. And as you know, Margaret Fuller was born in 1810 in Cambridge. She had a very classical, rigorous kind of education. Her father oversaw her studies, Greek, Latin, and so forth. She went on to be the editor of the Dial, the Transcendentalist newspaper. She led conversations with women in Boston, topics such as what is truth, what is beauty. She was the first female correspondent for the New York Tribune. And she eventually, in 1846, I think, went to Europe to observe the revolutions, and became caught up in the Italian Revolution of 1848, and met a young man who was very very much active in the revolution. They fell in love, they had a baby. She sent dispatches back to New York about what was going on. Anyway,
They may or may not have married.
they may or may not have married, we're not sure. And the baby's name, I think, was, they called him Angelino. But anyway, what was striking to me about Margaret Fuller was that she had gone through different phases, this kind of classical phase, the women's rights phase. She became interested in slavery, abolition, the plight of Native Americans. Then she went abroad, got caught up in the revolutionary movement there. And her writing in the process of the stages became more fluid, more engaging. In other words, she started out with kind of a formal, stiff style, and by the time she was sending dispatches back from Italy, the prose was clear, it was compelling. So I thought she was a great example of someone who really changed over time and learned a lot about the world around her. I was very engaged with her life for this one lecture. So the day came to give the lecture, and I marched through the high points of her life and came to the end, and she died in a shipwreck. She and Soli, her husband, the baby, died in a shipwreck just about 100 yards off Fire Island in New York, what is now New York, Fire Island, New York. And I was so overwhelmed. She was 40 years old when she died. And I started to weep in the classroom. I was just overcome with emotion because here was this young woman. She had so much promise. What would life hold for her once she returned? What would Emerson say about her and her new husband or lover? What would be the reaction of the baby? You know, how would she pursue her career? There were so many questions. But anyway, it was an introduction for me about kind of the uncertainties of the classroom, because this took me by surprise. You know, I was very proud I had all this information about her, and it totally unhinged me in a way. So, but I wrote this piece because, you know, it's hard not to get caught up in the emotion of the moment. So.
And you're right in the piece that combination of having empathy for your subject, but also being professional in the classroom, perhaps not weak in front of your students.
My students were mortified. You know, I could see them put their heads down and they were writing, and they just were thinking, "Oh, we didn't ask for this." So the next class, I began by asking them, you know, what had their reaction been, and it must have been unusual or kind of difficult. So that was good. But yeah.
Okay. Maybe just taking a step back, you are a social historian, labor historian, expert in the South. What brought you to those fields? I mean, you could have chosen anything to write about. Why did you end up in the areas that you ended up in?
Well, I grew up in a very small town in Delaware, segregated town, and was always curious about how that came to be. The elementary school I attended was integrated in 1955. But the vestiges, the residue of this really intense, brutal kind of segregation was still very much in this town. So I just developed a real interest in history and what had brought us to that point. The town had only 500 people, but it had 4 churches. 3 were Methodist, 1 was Presbyterian. That was religious diversity of this town. 2 were black, 2 were white, and they were all tiny. And there was one point where we had what was called a Union Thanksgiving service where all the 4 churches came together. That was quite a revelation. That was around 1960 or so. And it occurred to me that everybody, every Sunday, was singing exactly the same hymns. There were different preaching styles, but anyway, I was just always very curious about that. So for my dissertation, I wrote on the Northern teachers who went south after the Civil War to teach black men and women and children who had just been freed from slavery. And I was interested in the teachers, many of whom were from Massachusetts. I did a study of the teachers who went to Georgia. There were about 400 of them in the first few years after the war. And and beyond as well.
Well, let's take a moment. I know we won't do justice to any of your books, but I'm going to try to hit all three.
Oh,
I've picked three of the many that you've written. So this is the first that you just referenced, Soldiers of Light and Love, Northern Teachers in Georgia Blacks, 1865 to 1873. This is your first book. And you looked at the missionary records, as you said, of about 400 women, mostly young, white, middle-class Congregationalists.
Mhm.
They spend about 4 years on average. It's just a fascinating study, so maybe you could share some of the conclusions that came from that.
Yes, they were very idealistic. They had been very supportive of the abolitionist movement. They were primarily the daughters of farmers, old craftsmen. They were from all over New England, especially rural areas of New England, and they would say actually most of them didn't last beyond a year. It was hard. It was hard work. They were of course shunned by the whites they encountered in the South, and it was dispiriting for some of them to see the conditions, to see the poverty, the desperation of people who had been released from slavery, freed, and with very little to their names after, you know, their forebears, and they had literally slaved for white people for so long. In addition, the teachers clashed against the administrators. They didn't like the superintendents overseeing them because these men usually were not trained teachers. So it was difficult, and they got paid very little. I think $12 a month. So most of them went back home after a year or maybe 2 years. But it was, to me, it was an interesting story because they were so keen on writing down their experiences. So my database for my dissertation was the letters these teachers wrote to their superiors in New York City and also to donors in New England. And they have schoolmarm's handwriting, which was a plus. But these were all in microfilm. So I really, for a year or two, did nothing but read microfilm letters. But they were very moving. They were long. They had to walk a very fine line if they were going to get people to donate to this. They had to make it clear that the donations would be put to good use and the people were eager to be educated and get to work. On the other hand, if things sounded so great, they were in danger of instilling a kind of indifference in their northern audience. So the letters are quite interesting.
I'm paraphrasing, but you say on the surface it might appear that these young women failed. They were not able to reach most children, literacy rates rose, and ultimately the system goes back to the kind of Jim Crow type system. But you say it's not a complete failure. They were genuine in their commitment. They urged blacks to exercise new political rights, and they created some sense of goodwill through their efforts, but also the change in them, because I mean it's pretty remarkable that there was certain independence that they were able to experience, and we can talk a little bit about that.
Right, and I also had their letters of application where they had to make a pitch for a commission to go south because the teachers were chosen. There was a very rigorous application process, and they had to have letters of reference from their local minister and so forth. But many of them do speak about the opposition of their parents and also their neighbors, that this was considered very dangerous work. It was considered kind of frivolous. But they persisted, and some of them, of course, I know, saw this as the greatest adventure in their lives. They were far from home. To some extent, they were on their own, and they encountered a group of people whom they considered very different from themselves, and I think they had to learn a lot in the process themselves.
The fact that you just said they persisted reminds me of Mitch McConnell talking about Elizabeth Warren. A quote from the book, he said, "Leaving the homes of their fathers, they searched for ways to use their talents in a higher spiritual realm. Perhaps on a modest scale, the triumph was theirs after all." That was a nice conclusion. I'll introduce you in case you don't know. So there was a young African-American woman here in Concord named Ellen Garrison. If you know the story at all. So we have her letters. And I'll just read a couple, because I'm not a historian, so I don't have the thrill of, I'm not sure reading all that microfilm sometimes. But anyway, there's a couple, I mean, this is fun. We had a forum here earlier this summer on her. So June of 1863, again, she's a young African-American woman, educated, conquered beautiful penmanship as well. So, dear sir, I have a great desire to go and labor among the freedmen of the South. I think it is our duty as a people to spend our lives in trying to elevate our own race. Who can feel for us if we do not feel for ourselves, and who can feel the sympathy that we can, who are identified with them. I should like to go as soon as possible. So she ends up going down to Port Deposit, Maryland. But then as you're reading the letters, it's fascinating because, of course, then there's division, and the division is between the African-American community. So clearly the word one might use is she was an uppity black. And so Ruth writes to the American Missionary Society or Association. You know, this is to inform you, we are speaking the voice of the people in consideration of the present circumstances. We petition that the honorable body for a teacher with due respect to the one that we have formerly had. They go on to say we need a better teacher, you know, in our town. And then some individuals who have poorer grammar write, we thank you for the kindness in sending us such a good teacher. You're hearing from the wrong. So you just hear this kind of split. It's kind of a fascinating story.
Well, I will just say this about the American Missionary Association. They were quite aggressive in proselytizing on behalf of the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians. And they completely offended the black preachers they encountered. Almost all of them were Baptist or Methodist. So that was a real point of contention. But the AMA could afford to offer free schools for black children, and many of the black teachers in the South, and there were a number of black teachers from Georgia, had to impose a very modest tuition fee on their pupils, and so the AMA just was able to push out all those black teachers and didn't even hire them as assistants. So it is, it's
right. Fascinating.
Yeah.
So then we'll move to. I think this is probably considered your best known book, and the one that won the Bancroft. Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women Work in the Family from Slavery to the Present. And I joked with Jackie that to have Toni Morrison write the blurb on the top of your book is a pretty extraordinary thing. So it's essentially a labor history of black women from slavery to today, with a special focus on the nexus between work and family. And maybe just, I'll say a couple more words and then maybe the title captures your main thesis that racial and gender discrimination have defined the nature of black women's work and the size of their paychecks, and have made work an excruciating ordeal endured not for personal satisfaction but for bare bones survival, but because they did it for their families and communities. So the first part is the labor of sorrow, but because they did it for their families and communities, it's a labor of love. Tell us a little bit more.
right. Well, I decided to write this book because I was teaching a course at Wellesley College in women's history. I developed that my second or third year there. And I remember one day we were talking about women sweatshop workers in New York City on the eve of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, how miserable the conditions were, the low pay, the long hours, the stuffy room. And one of my students said, well, yes, but at least they were working and they didn't have to stay home with the kids. I thought, oh, well, they have a very odd idea of work and how liberating work is. I mean, my students thought of working women as college presidents, professors, physicians, lawyers. They had no firm grasp of the conditions under which most women worked. And I thought, well, someone needs to set them straight here. So I decided to write this book to show the pull of family life and how difficult it was to go out and work in someone else's house, cook the food for the family, take care of the children, knowing that your own children were either home alone or maybe in the care of a neighbor or a relative, to get very little pay for those long hours of work for a white family. So that was kind of the motivation in writing the book. And I found such a wealth of material. In fact, this is the anniversary edition, the 25th anniversary edition that came out in 2010. was originally published in 1985. And I couldn't grasp all of the new work that had been written in that time. It was just, there had been an explosion of scholarship in Black history, women's history. So, and bibliography, I think, might run to over 1,000 citations. It was really, now that was a labor of sorrow. Because that was difficult. But anyway, yes.
So you, one of the theses is that Black women put their own stamp in their work situations, and they placed familial and communal priorities first. That they gravitated to certain types of jobs, avoiding regimentation and enhancing their family time where they could. Just maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, when they could, actually, when I did my first book, I realized that in the South, a lot of enslaved women who had worked in the fields, once liberated, withdrew from field labor. In other words, slave owners were keen on putting to work anybody basically over the age of 10 or 12 in the fields, and that included women. So women constituted a substantial proportion of the labor force under slavery. And once those women began to withdraw from field work, it caused consternation among these white planters. And I realized there were a lot of good reasons for that, to withdraw from the work. In a lot of cases, the overseer, the man who was the boss, was keeping them at work, was sexually abusive to them. They wanted to make sure their own kids were being taken care of. Their husbands didn't want them working in the fields anymore. There were a lot of reasons why they withdrew. But that got me to thinking, when I was doing the first book, what were some of the larger implications of this withdrawal from field work? What did it mean? Why did they do it? So I think that started me on this too.
And again, we can't do justice to these books, but in the more modern era, in 1970s, the thing that I was interested in, you write that Black women in general had high levels of motivation, but low aspirations when it came to planning their careers. They hoped to go into traditional fields like social work and teaching. Can you chat about that?
Well, certainly for generations, the mechanisms of discrimination and exclusion were quite striking, affecting Black men and women. I'm finishing a book now on Black workers in Boston during the Civil War era, and they were limited so strictly to service positions. White men were tradesmen, craftsmen, white-collar workers, entrepreneurs, and yet the discrimination that Black men and women faced was really, and it was not only on the part of employers, but it was also on the part of white employees who didn't want to work with them in the same work site. Government entities encouraged this kind of discrimination. So, yeah, by the 1970s, most Black working women were limited to service positions. They were working in nursing homes or in cafeterias. Some, of course, were teachers, but they were small in number compared to these service positions. So when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed and these jobs for the first time became open to Black men and women, they rushed to fill them. It was not too long after that that the global economy began to shift a lot of jobs overseas. Terrible irony that just as they were beginning to have more opportunity in the workplace, that workplace to a certain extent began to contract. So,
Totally anecdotal, but I used to help low-income high school students out in Western Mass be the first in their families to go to college. Kids from Hartford, Springfield, Holyoke, Hartford, obviously, in Connecticut, not Western Mass. And almost to a person, the young women, colored, Puerto Rican, and African American, who wanted to be social workers. And I often thought they came from kind of dysfunctional families, and there was this notion of that they wanted to help people. And I think they'd go off to college and then find other things. But in high school, that was almost to a person, that young woman, whereas the men had, young men had all different kinds of options.
well, and sometimes they take cues from their relatives. and their neighbors and what they're doing.
Right, yeah.
And if the neighborhood, you know, if the job opportunities are limited, then they'll set their sights accordingly.
So we'll switch to your last book, and I have some general questions too. A Dreadful Deceit, The Myth of Race from the Colonial Era to Obama's America. And I wanted to use race in the title of this session, and Jackie said, well, since I don't believe in race, you can't use it in the title. So tell us again why you kind of don't believe in race, and maybe I'll use a few lines from your book. In your introduction, you say, racial mythologies are best understood as a pretext for political and economic opportunism, and that whites have used the idea of race to advance their own interests. So maybe tell us a little bit more why you think race, I know why you think race is in this book, about that concept, and then, you know, the pieces of the book.
Well, academics are used to talking about race as a social construct. Race is socially constructed, and I always thought that might be difficult for people outside the academy to understand. What does that even mean? Everybody can look around and see that race makes a big difference in the way society is organized and the way our history has unfolded. So how could it not exist? What does exist are what I call racial ideologies, which are ideas about race. This rage to classify, to categorize people according to, in this case, skin color or heritage. So I thought that rather than do kind of an analytical study, that I would tell 6 stories about 6 individuals in the nation's history, beginning with an enslaved man named Antonio in 1654, Maryland, and coming up to Detroit auto worker Charles Denby in the 20th century, and just look at how their lives were affected by this idea of race, when it mattered, when it didn't, how the idea developed, how it came to have so much power. It was a process. It was a process. I mean, it's racial prejudice is not a universal or primal impulse. It's the product of circumstances, and that's why I thought it was important to talk about these racial ideologies within a specific place and a specific time. So Providence, Rhode Island in the 1830s, Savannah, Georgia in the 1870s, Mississippi in the early 20th century. Each story is rooted in a very particular time and place.
Let's take a minute and have you tell us one or two. I had a couple notes on which ones would you like to talk about?
Well, since she's from New England, I'll just say a few words about Eleanor Eldridge, who was of Narragansett and African descent, living in Rhode Island, and she was the most amazing worker. She did a wide variety of jobs. She was a whitewasher, she was a servant, she was a drover, an egg gatherer, a seamstress. She did all these jobs in the course of her career, but she was also very shrewd. In the money she saved, she invested in real estate. So she got into trouble because she overextended herself. But her memoir was really written by a white woman she worked for as a servant. And it's a fascinating story to know what can be verified with historical evidence. That is what I can find out about her in the census and other kinds of documents, versus what the story she tells. And it's a story of, kind of, woe is me, I worked so hard and now I'm being cheated by the sheriff who wants to repossess my house. But in fact, the story was a little more complicated than that, but she made the best use of her white patrons. She had a very high-priced lawyer, but he was someone she had worked for as a servant. So it's a fascinating story, and it kind of contradicts all these stereotypes in the 1830s, especially in New England, of people of color. These are people who were enslaved in the 18th century. They are emancipated late 18th, early 19th century, but they have the stigma of slavery still attached to them, and their Pulitzer credit or cash to speak of. So, but she defies all these stereotypes. And she's quite the prevaricator. I mean, there are stories she makes up. She has to have a lover. She never married. She's quite disdainful of marriage. But I think the white woman who helped her probably said, you know, look, we're running in the 1830s. You've got to work up this notion of the sentimental family. It was almost yours. The guy died in a shipwreck. Anyway, she was an amazing character.
And maybe the labor organizer story is quite interesting. The role race plays in the union, and you talk about that.
Right. Charles Danby Simon Owens was his real name. He too wrote a memoir, Indignant Heart, and used a pseudonym for that. He he was born in Alabama, migrated to Detroit, and became linked up with a Marxist cell, really. The group was called Marxist Humanism, and it was very much influenced by Raya Dunayevskaya, who was a Trotsky's secretary. But anyway, here is this Alabama guy in Detroit who was very much, very well read on Marxist theory and wrote a column for one of the local labor journals. But he realized how discriminatory the shop floor was in Detroit auto plants, and how even though the Ruthers might talk in very enlightened terms about racial egalitarianism, conditions on the shop floor were miserable for black men especially. So he was fascinated. He was always very hopeful until late in his life he went down back to Lowndes County, Alabama, and he realized that the young people there didn't know anything about the region's history, and he found that really depressing. So, yeah.
So we may have buried the headline a little bit. I just want to go back to, your notion is that it's not about race per se, but that race is about power and domination, and that race is used kind of by those in power to keep those who don't have power away.
I think you mentioned, I said it's a pretext for establishing a certain kind of division of labor. And it's a powerful force. When I say race doesn't exist, I mean that we can't classify people on a hierarchy of races the way scientific racists began to do in the 19th century. But we have to ask, I think, who benefits at any particular time and place from these ideas of racial difference?
Mm-hmm.
To whose benefit are these ideas? Who is able to accrue more money or power or influence because of these ideas? And once you begin to ask that, then it becomes clear how these ideas of racial difference are very fluid. Just one example, I found that in the antebellum South, textile mill owners were happy to employ enslaved machine operatives, or people, the machines weren't very sophisticated, but these were enslaved people, men and women who worked looms and so forth in these water-powered mills in the Piedmont of the South. And enslaved people were seen as good workers because they learned quickly, and they couldn't go on strike, and they couldn't demand schooling for their children, and they couldn't come in late any one day. They seemed so superior to white workers. Well, by the 1880s, things have changed drastically, and these mill owners began to want to bring white people into the mills, and they began to say black people are incapable of working machines. They're incapable of working this equipment. They're best suited for field work. And you have to ask, well, what their grandfathers thought very differently. What's changed? Well, they wanted to bring in poor whites off the countryside because they didn't want any interracial coalitions forming there in the 1880s and 1890s. And this was one way to separate whites from blacks.
The books are not frozen in time, but the reissue ends with Michelle Obama, and this again was with Obama's American. There's just certain optimism, kind of that you comment, I mean, now we look at it after the Trump era, but, did the Obama presidency change things, you know, the way that people think about Jesus?
Well, I mean, there's several layers to that answer, I think, and I really liked to end, yes, in 2010, I ended Labor of Love with Michelle Obama and her story, because she's from enslaved people in South Carolina, and, you know, a graduate of Princeton, and obviously very successful in her own right. And I wanted to give expression to, you know, the many prominent, accomplished, distinguished women of African descent that we're familiar with today and that are, you know, dominate the media and entertainment and professional life, politics too. But if we look at the enduring reality of discrimination, we're struck by how stubborn that has been. And, you know, again, we talk about structural racism. I don't think most people know what that means, but it means that over years, if you keep people isolated in ghettos, if through redlining or predatory lending or however, neighborhood improvement associations, people are not allowed to move out of those impoverished places, buy homes of their own. After a while, it's going to show up in the assets of individual families, and that's true today, where average white assets are, I think, maybe 17 times the average black assets, and that has to do with these processes over time, which kept the black community for so many generations locked into these neighborhoods. Now, what I've just described, of course, is the sinister critical race theory. Because that's all it is, right? It's just a description of how, over the generations, these kinds of discrimination erode any kind of drive for equality. And even in the face of major civil rights legislation, these really devastating historical forces have taken a tremendous toll.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience in a minute. I realize we don't have mics. I don't think we'll pass them around, so I'll ask you questions to be brief, and then I'll repeat them for people who are watching. I'm interested as the president of the AHA, the role that, not so much the critical race theory, let's stay away from that, but the role that historian plays in policy debates. And I'll give an example. Ellen's year, I don't know if it's true or not, but supposedly John F. Kennedy, it's often done in foreign policy. So John F. Kennedy wanted his cabinet or his advisors to read Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman's book about how World War I unfolded, because he didn't want to stumble into a world war in itself. And I know there's kind of a whole, I'm sure there's much more than I know about kind of applied history, like taking lessons from history and, you know, applying them to the challenges of our time. Is that the role of, what's the role of the historian in contemporary policy debates?
Well, our constituents are varied, including museum curators, high school teachers, professors, community college instructors. So it's difficult to talk about one typical historian. I know that Obama used to have meetings of historians.
Right, yeah.
One of my colleagues from Texas, Bill Brands, was included often in those. He was interested in history. And so I think, you know, presidents, policymakers vary in terms of their willingness to understand history. I remember I was at some kind of reception. It was pretty early in my career, and I was talking to a very famous sociologist. And I said, I'm a historian. And he said, I don't know much history. And then there was a pause, and he said, I don't think I'm missing much. And I thought, oh, okay. You know, he just saw no use. You know, is there a use for history? He was entirely skeptical of that. So the AHA makes advocacy statements. We do hope to make a public statement when a historian is denied access to the archives, when a historian is censored, or in some cases persecuted. We try and make a statement when state legislatures begin to meddle in K through 12 curriculum, or decide how museum staff should or should not be educated. And we found ourselves very busy actually over the last couple of years doing that.
Do you have questions from the audience? I have a few more, but if you don't. Well, I have one that Ellen gave me, so I'll give Ellen's question more, which is that Arthur Schlesinger talked about there being kind of cycles of history. Do you buy into this notion?
I don't think I have that kind of perspective to be able to make that kind of statement. When I do these projects, the first book was covered an 8-year period. The current book I'm working on covers a 25-year period. These are very small chunks of history, and it's hard to get a sense of the grand sweep. I mean, the Boston book is certainly going to provide a context and a background for what the region looks like today, I think. But as for the cycles of reform, reaction, I think, we could say, the progressive era began to diminish in the 1920s with reaction, and of course, there's been a reaction to the New Deal in the 40s and 50s. So I do see that, I guess. Well, Trump was a reaction to Obama. I guess we could look at that.
This might be an unfair question, but so you grew up in Delaware and did a lot of your teaching here in New England, but you spent most of your professional career in Texas, which...
13 years,
okay.
or 16 years at Wellesley College, 16 years at Brandeis,
Okay.
2 years at Brown, and then 13 at UT. So that was really...
Are those worlds as different as we perceive them to be, or when you're at the University of Texas at Austin, it feels...
I went to the University of Wisconsin as a graduate student, so I love the big state school scene.
Yeah.
And I did love UT, the city of Austin. It was a great city. Once you get into the classroom, it's pretty much the same everywhere. But it's been great.
But I'll push yours a little further.
Oh.
I mean, can you, for those of us who can't understand what's going on in Texas, do you have any more insight having lived there, or is it?
Well, the only insight I have is that our governor is worried about being primaried from the right. And it's hard to believe that there's somebody further to the right than Greg Abbott. But yes, he is very worried about being primaried from the right, and that's why he's really eager to get these pieces of legislation passed: abortion, restricted voting rights, anti-CRT legislation. Yeah.
Good question.
As someone who recently got a PhD and has been really thinking about how we can, as museum professionals, apply some of this academic theory in ways that are public-facing and engaging and are accessible to different age groups, different communities, etc. And I think, you've been through the museum already, so, I think we've done a really successful job with phase 3, but I'm curious, as someone who's actively engaged in the academy and is probably looking at what's coming next, these sort of turns in the ways we think about history. What do you see on the horizon as kind of an exciting new way of thinking, and what of that do you think museum professionals will be able to apply to their methodologies?
And Jackie, just in case people couldn't hear, questions about what's exciting in terms of history, and especially in museum work and public history.
Well, this is a great example of scholarship that's put to good use for public history. And I will say that, despite all of this contentious debate about history and so forth, that Americans love history. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And you only have to look at their interest in genealogy, getting their own DNA examined. People watch historical documentaries, go to see Hollywood films about history, read historical fiction, which is maybe a little different from what we're talking about. But I just see a tremendous interest on the part of the public for history effort, history that's true. I say truth over myth and fact over fiction. And whenever you can counter the myths and the fiction with historical evidence, that's great. And I think people respond to that. It's just that sometimes the myths are very comforting and people latch on to them and don't want to let them go. But, you know, to broaden the history of Concord the way this museum has is everybody will be engaged, it seems to me. I mean, there's something for everybody. If this were only a museum about Thoreau and Emerson, you might have a more limited audience than the way it's presented here. So, and that's the product of the last, you know, 30 or 40 years or so, although Ellen will tell us that social history has been around for a long, long time. But I think it's now, just within the last couple decades, kind of penetrating not only museums, but also historical sites, plantations, for instance, have had to really reckon with, and again, they provide a more full, a more comprehensive, a more accurate view of the past when they go ahead and unearth the slave quarters, and when they talk about some of the less savory aspects of the plantation owner's life and his, you know, black family that was never acknowledged and that sort of thing. So that's all to the good, but it is a way of kind of using this new scholarship to inform the general public.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, what led you to move to Concord?
Oh, okay, well that's...
The question is, what led Jackie to move to Concord?
Okay, well, our family lived in Wellesley for many years, and then we went to Texas, but we have a daughter in Sudbury and a daughter in Amherst. So, and we do a lot of babysitting for the grandchildren in Sudbury. So that's why we're in Concord.
And a question here.
Yeah. Do you think the American political class is sufficiently educated in history?
General.
In general history on the world, when the most powerful country in the world, sometimes we frequently make such mistakes.
Right.
Or repeat mistakes that have already been done a long time ago.
So the question for the audience is the general leadership class in the United States very well educated in history?
Well, I would hate to indict the whole leadership class of the United States. Obviously, it's an uneven story there, but I think it is true that people who are uninterested in history lack the kind of imagination and lack the grasp of cultural differences, historical facts that a study of the past can provide. So, I mean, there are many benefits to be derived from reading history. Lessons might be one benefit, although I don't want to make a great claim about that. But history does allow you to develop a kind of empathy for people living in a different place and a different time. And I think that is a skill that many leaders need and probably relatively few have. But
I'll ask the last question.
Yeah.
So a fellow Bancroft Prize winner, actually two-time, Liz Combs was here recently, and she asked me to speak in a class that she was teaching at Harvard because they were finding fewer and fewer history majors. And they met as a department and realized partly, as you go into the academy or maybe be a high school history teacher, their students weren't seeing job opportunities. So she did a whole course in public history and museums and had case studies on Colonial Williamsburg, and we were a case study for her. So I wondered twofold, at the University of Texas, are the numbers consistent about history majors, or have you seen a decline? And second, I confess I didn't know that the American Historical Association, you have a whole sector that's about, so maybe you could talk a little bit
right.
about that.
Well, first of all, it was a national trend for several years to see a decline in history majors. However, I want to point out that with the proliferation of ethnic studies departments, a lot of students who would have been history majors are now majoring in Black studies, Studies, Mexican American Studies, Asian American Studies, Jewish American Studies. The list could go on. Middle Eastern Studies. History is a component to all of these. And yet, you know, I think we've lost some of our majors to some of these other departments. That doesn't mean they're not taking history classes, they are. Secondly, we have at UT and also through the AJ developed tremendously interesting websites about what one could do with a history major. I mean, you learn to write well, to think critically. These are skills that all employers want. We don't assume that our majors are going to go on into history, into museums or the academy. We assume they're going to be filmmakers, they're going to work for private companies, they're going to be financial advisors, they're going to be any number of different things. And what we do is profile our majors on the website. What can a history major do? It's almost anything. So I would really resist the idea that somehow history majors are going to go on and study history in a professional way. What they're going to do, though, is have a more, I think they're going to have a broader outlook on life. And again, they're going to have that quality of empathy and the ability to organize a research project. I mean, a lot of qualities that employers want.
Okay. I often like to read acknowledgments to books, and I thought I'd conclude with words that you wrote actually about your husband, but I think
Oh, he's there again.
oh, good. Well, I'm going to embarrass him, although they're lovely words and they're reflective of you. So you wrote, most important is compassionate vision for a just and free society, a community based on political and economic equality for all its members, and on tolerance and respect for diverse cultures as well as individuals, has informed not only his own work, but mine as well. I dedicate this book to him and to that ideal. So,
Jeffrey Abramson.
Jeffrey
We want to put it in.
but anyway, we celebrate your scholarship and the ideal for which it endeavors. So Jackie Jones, thank you so much
Oh, thank you.
for being here. Thank you all for